So I had a bit of an insight about how anxiety impacts my life and sort of what its purpose appears to be, and sort of how I learned to be anxious and what that kind of means in my life, and how it affects the way I make decisions. So it's pretty feeling unsettled yesterday. I had a couple of things floating around in my mind, but the main thing is I felt this tension in my chest, and I felt myself sort of not really wanting to be on the planet, in terms of feeling sort of a lack of anticipating joy in my life, and just sort of feeling like I've reached the point where nothing really seems real in terms of the reasons for why most people live and motivate themselves, and they look forward to things. And I was feeling sort of like none of my old motivations for being alive were really giving me much satisfaction. And what I felt like I was left with is just the tedium of having to maintain a comfortable body, and the tedium of doing routine things in my life to make sure that I have an existence that is relatively comfortable. But I was sort of just at the underneath of it, it felt like there was like a lack of feeling, not so much that there's no points to existence. It's just that none of the points to existence that I have sort of associated joy with seemed like they were much more than a very thin layer, a thin sort of image painted on top of something that is completely different and has nothing to do with the illusion of what most people and I myself have considered to be a joyous life, because of all the sort of, it just seemed like everything kind of, no matter how ideal the circumstances of your life are, it just seemed like tedium would follow, and tedium and sort of a disconnected feeling would follow me wherever I went. So, but that was like, partially what was the troubling thing of that is that I felt like this tension in my body that I wasn't really sure how to resolve, or exactly what the real sort of origin of it was. And then I saw, this sort of search for what's the matter. That's sort of part of the anxiety of like having to find something that is identifiable so that somehow my mind could be more at peace with the world as it is. And it felt like I couldn't really rest until I found something. And then if I did find something, my mind tended to want to fixate on it. And then, say, well, this is the problem. These are the solutions that are available. Pick one of these. And then, otherwise you're fucked. So it's like, I felt like being motivated not by a genuine desire of wanting to do something good for myself, something that I enjoyed, or something that would make me feel, that I felt drawn to, but sort of like making decisions purely to get away from the feeling of distress. And so there's no real desire there, only a veiled sort of attempt at escaping an unpleasant feeling. And so it's like I couldn't really, that in itself didn't feel appealing enough to make a decision to move forward in any particular direction, because even though it might lead away from from this mind that is accosting me and won't shut up, it's like it's not enough to motivate me to want to move forward. So it's like wanting something is different than deciding that thing means no longer suffering. Because what I realized was, the suffering itself is not going to go away, with the pursuit of this and that. Like the suffering, the generation of the suffering was more something that was like a deeply ingrained habit within myself. And it was a habit that I then realized, this is my father. This is how my father bullies himself and bullied me to make decisions. It's this narrowing of perception through fear and closing down all the doors until there's only one door available. And that door, the doors are the options here. So closing all the options until there's only one option available, and then fixating on that door, that option, as a means of escaping this maniacal feeling of, being in this fucking chamber of being yelled at by an angry voice inside of his head that will not leave him alone until he finally decides to go through that door that he's been pressured to go through. And so it's not going through a door because of the desire to get to what's behind that door. It's just having fixated onto that door and using that and to the exclusion of everything else to narrow down, so sort of to force his hand to only see one option available, because all the other options seem more terrifying than the one that seems least terrifying. And so it's like a way of fixating on the least horrible outcome and then forcing yourself to pursue that outcome, even though it's not what you want and you expect it to be an outcome that will lead to more problems. But it's like you have to choose it because everything else, you have no choice, because your mind sort of closes down your perception from all the available options by getting you to fixate on one thing and then to be motivated by that fear to follow through until you can't follow through until you reach the maximum threshold of fear and anxiety, and then you have to go through the door at some point, because your system can no longer handle the pressure of the internal sort of wheel that is, these voices in your head that are spinning, that are telling you, you have to do this, otherwise it's catastrophe, you're going to be fucked, you're going to be miserable if you don't, do this. If you don't do this now, there's going to be disaster and you have to do it, and there's just no other way, And so I realized that this feeling inside of me is something that most likely came from, me living, for the extent of time that I did with my father, and sort of absorbing his neuroticism and sort of his propensity to do things based on a feeling of threat, a feeling of a lack of choice and a narrowing of choice, rather than doing something from a relaxed standpoint and doing something not out of catastrophizing, but being relaxed and having a gentle sort of, doing it for, a genuine desire of love, of, just, being at ease and actually seeing the benefits and savoring, a feeling of savor, and sort of naturally moving towards what he wanted without pressure, but just going, following a natural inclination. And so I was, struggling with that yesterday, and my solution to whenever I, have something like this is to pay attention to it. Essentially try to get away from the verbal chatter in my brain and go into, well, where is this sensation? And then, at first it can be kind of like difficult to locate, because your mind sort of like wants you to avert your attention away from where the actual sensation in your body is that is sort of generating the thoughts, because the thoughts sort of, it's a strange sort of self-defense mechanism that the thoughts have, because it's like the thoughts don't want you to recognize where the source is in your body that is holding the tension that generates the thoughts. So it's like the thoughts are sort of almost like semi-autonomous and conscious, have some awareness that if you find their source, then they won't be able to continue to be generated. At least that's what it appears to be when I observe it. Because the the moment you try to put your attention onto your body, your thoughts want to start take your attention away from that. But yeah, what I noticed was the tension in my chest, and I could feel that sort of that the originator of this tension in my chest was like, oh yeah, this is something that I've started feeling when I started living with my father, this constant feeling of having to compress myself, keep my own counsel, and sort of in order to tolerate, my father's sort of often very abrupt and jarring ways of like springing things onto me, and then sort of trying to motivate me with fear and threats and anger, and just sort of overwhelming my system. And so like my way of coping with that, I think, was to like tighten the muscles, particularly around my heart, to sort of protect myself from that. But in the way we protect ourselves, often we absorb, what we absorb is like a defense mechanism that almost in a way ends up leading us to emulate some of the things that end up being the source of our suffering. And anyhow, so recognizing that, I was kind of observing my feeling of despondency, but also not, it's like, yes, my mind is uneasy and I'm not comfortable in my body, and I don't really feel like I feel like I'm a bird, and like every time I try to land on a branch, like the branches keep moving, so I'm like a bird that can't land on a tree because the tree is like a fucked up weird tree. But in recognizing that it is like something in my body, that if I can observe it, and through observation, I become less, I double down less on the anxiety of the thoughts that are like, I take the weight of the thoughts is taken out more quickly, because I know that my mind is not telling me the truth about, what is going to be the future, what is the present, what is the meaning of the suffering. The mind is going to tell me all this scary shit that is going to be difficult to really sort out. And then, so like the best thing that, the best solution to this seems to be that just to remember that, well, these are thoughts, and it doesn't really mean the truth is not going to be within these anxious thoughts. Whatever the truth is going to, I may not be able to see it, but it's not that. It's not within this catastrophizing, because the catastrophizing is serving a point, and the point seems to be to force me into making decisions out of fear, and that's not the truth. So that, remaining steady within myself and remaining aware of the sensations in my body, that's where I feel, the most safest, the safest in the storm. And that's where I feel I sort of regain some of my ability to make choices from love and from a peaceful desire, rather than being constricted. And also, it's sort of like recognizing the sensations in the body is sort of like a way of acknowledging your own existence, because you live in your body And when you're not aware of what is going in your body, it's kind of like you're not aware of where you are actually physically. Because if you're in your head thinking about these things, and then they're inducing feelings inside your body, but you're not paying attention to the feeling, you're paying attention to the thoughts, so you know that you're uncomfortable, but you're not, your attention isn't consolidated enough to recognize where you're uncomfortable, because you keep outsourcing to your mind, hoping for some solution to the problem, instead of being with the problem itself, which is something that is like a sensation in the body. Anyhow, so yeah, in doing that, I was able to kind of like see the origin. It seems to be like catastrophizing in order to force my hands into putting me into such a frightened state where I feel like I have to jump out of like a burning building essentially to save my life, and not to make choices out of genuine desire, but out of, fear of death and, harm and, whatever, all kinds of calamities. Anyhow, so yeah, I think I've explained it pretty decently. So I'll leave it here. You guys have a good one.